The youngest Cuban to have participated in a free election is 86 years old in 2021. It has been over 60 years since Cuba's last free election. In all that time, the government has been in the hands of the same people that took power without a vote. They impose their communist ideology on all of the state institutions and outlawed all private initiatives. The military elite, which holds political power, controls all aspects of people's lives, from the price of sugar to media access and children's education. The country is in a permanent state of crisis, though the world is unaware of the sheer magnitude of social and material lack that Cubans face. The myths created by the so-called Cuban Revolution obscure a reality that's all the more unbearable, marked by repression and lack of opportunity. From the outside, the Cuban dictatorship is judged based on symbols and promises, not by results. To understand how the simulation of a country made of cardboard and propaganda has replaced the real Cuba, we're going to have to analyze some of the established myths that got us here. The July 26 movement, led by Fidel Castro, assumed power over Cuba by force on January 1st, 1959. At the time, the promise was that they would restore the constitutional order that the Batista dictatorship had broken in 1952. However, like always, Castro was lying. The world has seen the images of the city square full of Cubans supporting the revolution. But the reality is that not even during their moment of glory did the Castros believe that the people would vote for them. That is why they never held the free elections they promised. Instead, they introduced a communist system, imposed censorship, and orchestrated massive executions of opponents. They sentenced the country to economic dependence, first on the Soviet Union and in recent years on Venezuela, a country which they also helped destroy. From the beginning, Cuba's new regime outlawed all media, except those owned by the communist state. It developed a powerful propaganda apparatus for the purpose of domestic indoctrination and self-promotion abroad. This was a valuable tool used to muddy facts and rewrite history through lies that nullified democratic and liberal ideals. The lie was so well crafted that while there were tens of thousands of political prisoners being held in Cuban prisons and young people being shipped off to forced labor camps as punishment, check this, for listening to rock, having religious beliefs, being gay, or just because they were not communists, the world continued to call Cuba the island of liberty. The revolution was a lie. According to propaganda, Cubans enjoy free health care, but the reality is that medicine is expensive and widespread shortages cause prices to multiply in the black market, making them completely inaccessible to most. The official claim is that all citizens are equal, yet only the ruling class and tourists have access to care in the nation's top hospitals, while the rest of us, well, we make do with the poor hygiene and the supply shortages of subpar hospitals. There, patients must bring their own food, bed sheets, even the water that they expect to drink. The conditions are so bad that patients' lives are in danger. For example, on a cold night in 2010, dozens of medically neglected and starving patients froze to death at a psychiatric hospital on the Caribbean island. Ironically, in communist Cuba, paid premium healthcare services do exist. It's of superior quality and available exclusively to foreigners. These privatized medical centers unapologetically deny care to Cubans and refuse their admission even if they can afford to pay. Healthcare professionals are exploited and poorly paid to the point that many prefer to go into semi-slavery on medical missions in other countries like Venezuela. These missions are disguised under the myth of proletarian internationalism, when in reality, they are commercial agreements in which the regime pockets more than 75% of the doctors' salaries. These missions are also used for espionage and ideological penetration. For example, out of 702 supposed Cuban doctors in Bolivia, 497 were not medical graduates. The regime proudly boasts having the best healthcare system in the world, yet the quality of care and access to medicine for the average Cuban is not guaranteed. The vast majority of Cuban children can go to school, but the education system is completely politicized and serves as a means of indoctrination and control. Children of dissidents and religious families are oftentimes victims of bullying by students and teachers. University students who challenge or criticize the system are expelled. The quality of instruction is poor and outdated. Teachers are poorly compensated. Without the proper resources to train in the 21st century, the state graduates unprepared teachers on their express plan and calls them emerging professors. Another aspect of the Cuban socialist myth is free education. The reality is that all of the salaries of Cuban professionals fall far below the real value of their work. While it is true that students do not have to pay for tuition, when they graduate, they must complete several years of social service, indentured servitude, at the discretion of the state while earning an even lower salary. This is semi-forced labor. The state is reimbursed for its educational expenses. In the 21st century, education in Cuba is not free. One of the most terrible humiliations imposed by the totalitarian state on Cuban families is the crappy food and the difficulties to obtain it. For 60 years, food in Cuba has been linked to the ration card. It's a practice used in times of war and misery, but the Cuban communism represents it as an icon of stability. Thanks to the monthly rationing system, people who can afford it are able to buy poor quality food that barely covers one family's basic needs for about a week. Finding the food for the rest of the month, well, that takes up a large part of the time, energy, and salaries of most Cubans. Cuba imports 80% of the food it consumes, but it does not meet the food and nutritional needs of its people. In many of his delirious speeches, Fidel Castro promised that Cuba would produce enough milk to fill the Bay of Havana. However, the regime destroyed the country's productive capacity and continues to pursue independent production to this day. In 1959, there were more cattle heads than Cuban citizens, but in 2021, beef is so scarce that it is reserved exclusively for foreigners. Slaughtering a cow without permission of the state is prohibited. Therefore, it's a crime punishable by several years in jail. The situation is so dire that in some extremes, people have resorted to consuming domestic animals like cats. After 6 decades of revolution and communism, Cubans are hungry. Besides hunger, more than 2 million people in socialist Cuba are suffering a housing deficit. Homes collapse at a faster rate than those that are built. According to conservative sources, 1 out of every 7 buildings is in danger of collapse. This oftentimes leads to 3 generations being forced to live in the same house, with the consequent family conflicts that overcrowding imposes. 8 out of every 100 homes lack continuous electrical service. And almost 7 out of every 100 Cubans do not have a permanent water supply. In 2020 alone, dozens of fatalities were reported, including children and elderly victims as a result of structural collapse. Now, those who survived such a collapse, guess what? They have to continue inhabiting their homes amid ruins. Today's Cubans live in rubble. Cuba could very well be renamed the island of goodbyes. In addition to poverty, you add political oppression and no chance of developing or expressing independent initiatives. As a result, many seek to leave the country as their only viable and immediate solution. In fact, close to 2 million Cubans have taken the path of exile despite the restrictions imposed on leaving the island. Families separated and mass exodus are all part of Cuba's recent history. Almost all of them orchestrated by authorities to alleviate internal tensions, but also to blackmail the international community, namely the United States. It happened in 1980 during the María boat lift, when 125,000 Cubans managed to leave the country on boats sent by their relatives from Florida. The regime permitted the exodus on the condition of also filling the ships with common criminals released from prisons and patients from nearby psychiatric hospitals. It happened again in 1994 with the rafter crisis. Castro withdrew his Coast Guards as a reaction to the massive anti-establishment protests that were taking place in Havana. As a result, between August and September of that year, more than 32,000 Cubans were intercepted in the Florida Straits. The exact death figures were never published, but the Cuban-American organizations that worked to rescue rafters in those years calculate that out of every 4 vessels that left the island, only 1 arrived safely. Thousands disappeared into the sea forever. Yet despite the deaths, the dangers, and the uncertainty, Cubans continue their attempts to escape the island. They may not have held free elections in Cuba for decades, but this persistent stampede of Cubans greatly represents the people's vote against a communist system and is an eloquent symbol of revolutionary failure. The resistance to Castroism took shape from the beginning and has not stopped to this very day. Despite repression, a portion of the Cuban people have never stopped rebelling against totalitarian power. The opposition holds popular support despite the fear instilled in the people by the authorities. During certain years, the dictatorship managed to punish entire populations. For example, during the 60s and the early 70s, thousands of families were forcefully removed from their homes and relocated hundreds of kilometers away in reconcentration camps that transformed into kind of captive villages. According to the files recovered from the Stasi, at one point, there were up to 65,000 political prisoners serving jail sentences at the same time. Today, there are more than 140 sentenced for political reasons, not including the thousands of innocent young people that the regime keeps in prison prophylactically under the fabricated charge of pre-criminal danger. Today, those who express their disagreement are harassed, they're detained and threatened by the political police or state security. The repressive methods used by members of the regime can range from social isolation, expulsion from work or study centers, physical violence, imprisonment, even murder. Such was the fate of the opposition leader Osvaldo Payá and the young Harold Cepero during the 2012 attack. However, Cubans continue to fight with increasing force. Young activists take to the streets in protests, and today there are many of us who demand a systemic change. Organized public protests are multiplying throughout the nation. The voice of the opposition, together with the Cuban people's will for change, can no longer be ignored. They continue to expand and claim freedom in an irreversible way. The myths created by Castroism have lost their hold on the people. Cubans are done with the lies. Cuba Decide is an international and citizen-driven initiative to change the system in Cuba towards democracy and the rule of law. It seeks to subject the regime to the sovereign will of the people at the polls and make a way for change. Now that you are aware of the reality and the proposed solution, you can be part of the change to support the Cuban people's right to decide. The change is in your hands. Join us.